as we are now heading into the All-Star break, I am going to do a little bit of a prediction video where I'm going to be talking about 10 teams that will miss the playoffs by the end of the season, because we're getting to that point where I think I do have a good idea of who exactly is done for the season, and that most likely they are not going to make the playoffs by the end of the season, and that I'm going to be talking about 10 teams that will miss the playoffs, 5 from the West, 5 from the East, because that is going to be the amount of teams that's going to miss the playoffs by the end of the season. And before I begin this video, I do want to say that if I do put your team on the board, don't take this personal and don't think that your team is definitely going to miss the playoffs, because this is my prediction, and if my prediction kind of conflict into your prediction, or you disagree with your team being on the board as the team that will miss the playoffs this season, then let me know in the comments below, and you can always explain why you disagreed with this list or disagree with a team that I put on the board that will most likely miss the playoffs. But that being said, let us begin with the Western Conference, and the first team that I think will miss the playoffs this season is going to be Vancouver. And this shouldn't be a big surprise, because Vancouver is one of the worst teams in the Western Conference, and downrightly one of the worst teams in the league. And you're going to see that some of the teams that I put in this list is near the bottom of the table, and that as much as this season I think both conferences there's been really a very tight gap between first to all the way down to like around 10th place. When you look at the bottom of the table, yeah, there's not really that much of a gap to the playoff line. That there seems like there's a cutoff line in terms of 10th place in both conferences, where the bottom two teams are just downright awful. And unfortunately for Vancouver, they are one of those teams that kind of belongs to that. And that when you look at how they've been playing in these last couple of weeks, it kind of explained to you that they are probably not going to make the playoffs. And it's unfortunate that after all the signings that they have made that potentially could start the rebuild for the Whitecaps has really just backfired, and that most of the signings that they have done have just not shown up whatsoever. So I think the Whitecaps will be the team that will miss the playoffs in the Western Conference. Is the first team that I predicted. The second team that I predicted that's going to miss the playoffs is going to be the Colorado Rapids. And, you know, a couple of weeks ago when they were on an unbeaten run, I really believed that this team could potentially make the playoffs, because they were really like charging their way up the table after they just got off to just a historic bad start to MLS. But recently, with them losing 3 straight games, yeah, it looked like their chances of making the playoffs is started to slip away, and that they once again find themselves at the bottom of the Western Conference. Now, having said that, I think that, you know, this team, if they can somehow find a way to go on another good run, and that I think they definitely have the talent to do that. You know, that attack for the Rapids, I think a lot of people don't give them enough credit of the fact that it's actually a very decent kind of attack, and it could be very dangerous going forward, and that team definitely should fear in terms of that attack going forward. But I just think right now with the Rapids, one of the biggest problems they have this season has been that defense have not been very good. The midfield at times could be a little bit iffy. So yeah, I mean, you know, the Rapids, obviously with them being off to that historic bad start, it doesn't really help their favor in terms of them potentially getting into the playoffs, and that when you dig yourself into that deep of a hole to start the season, you almost need to be almost perfect for the remaining of the season if you want to get into the playoffs, and that you can't just have like another cold run where the Rapids is kind of having right now, that you would expect to potentially make the playoffs at the end of the season. But the next team that I think is going to miss the playoffs in the Western Conference is going to be the Houston Dynamo. And the Dynamo, they have 5 games remaining at home, and they have 7 games remaining on the road. And if my math is correct on that, I think even if they win most of the 5 games that they have at home, I don't think it will be enough for them to make the playoffs. And that, this Dynamo team has just relied so much on their home form in terms of making the playoffs, and that we know the road form is clearly one of the worst in the league. I just have a feeling, especially this year with how strong the Western Conference is, they are going to miss out, and that this is going to be one of those years where even if you have a good home form, it's not going to be enough to make the playoffs. And especially the fact that the last two home games that the Dynamo have been playing in the league has been lost for them, that does not help their causes in terms of making the playoffs. And I know their last two games were playing against the top two team in the Western Conference in LAFC and Seattle Sounders. But if you look at that LAFC game, they were facing an LAFC team that wasn't even their strongest team, and that they were also playing a Seattle team that didn't had a good game, and that they could have capitalized or get at least a point or all 3 points in this. So yeah, for the Dynamo, I just think that with them, even if they win their remaining home games, as long as they don't pick up some points or win some games on the road, I just don't see how they are going to make the playoffs by the end of the season. But the next team that I'm gonna think that is gonna miss the playoffs, and we're getting to a territory where I'm debating whether if these two teams is gonna miss the playoffs, and that I'm gonna have some disagreement when I put these two teams as the teams that's gonna miss the playoffs from the Western Conference. And the first team I put there is Dallas, and the only reason why I put Dallas in that list is because they have played the most game in the Western Conference, and I believe technically, I think they have a 4-point gap in terms of the playoff line, or a 2-point gap. I gotta also double check in terms of the standing, but I know for a fact that they have played the most game in the Western Conference, and that there are some teams that is below the red line that has a game in hand over Dallas, who have played I think 24 games so far this season in the Western Conference. As I'm going to open up the standing here. Let's see. Oh, actually, they have a 2-point gaps between the playoff line. So technically, Dallas is actually below the red line if every team is played the same amount of games. And one thing that I do worry about Dallas is the second half collapse, because we've seen it in the past two seasons where right around, I think around August and September, this is when the collapse began. It happened last year, where it happened right near the end, where they were in prime spot of potentially finish top in the Western Conference, and then they started to kind of collapse and started to the pushback really started to show for this team, and they end up finished fourth in the Western Conference and got eliminated in the first round. And then, yeah, I don't really need to talk about what happened in 2017 because I mentioned it a lot, and I'm pretty sure Dallas fans know what happened in 2017. That is something that I'm pretty sure Dallas fans will really want to get what happened. But yeah, I do worry about Dallas in terms of their chances of going to the playoffs with how bad they have been in the past couple of seasons, and that collapse of the second half could happen. And this season, unlike previous season, they cannot afford to have a collapse in the second half of the season. Like last year, they were way up in the table, where even if they have a little bit of a collapse, they might fall down to the table right around the middle part of the table in the Western Conference. This season, they cannot afford to do that. So yeah, I do worry about Dallas in terms of that situation, but if they do not have that collapse, and if they can maintain their current form, which I think should still be good enough for them to make the playoffs, then I think they could definitely make the playoffs. And the last team that I think could miss the playoffs, and I talk about how these two teams that I think I'm going to have some disagreement with fans that say that they definitely are not going to miss the playoffs, is Minnesota. And I put Minnesota there mainly because if you look at their September schedule, it is a murderous row kind of schedule. Like, they have to play LAFC twice in September. They have to play Portland away. They have to play Seattle away. And they do have a couple of very important games against teams that they are going to be fighting for those playoff spots, like RSL and Sporting KC. And, while Minnesota is in fifth right now, and they are, I believe, 4 points above the red line, that September schedule really scares me about this team. And that, if they do not get get a lot of points out of that September schedule, they might they might miss out in terms of the playoffs. And that, I know it sounds crazy because a lot of people think that Minnesota is in a good position of making the playoffs after they have gone unbeaten in 9 games. But when you look at these games that they have played, I mean, it isn't like most of the games that they have been playing has been pretty easy opponent and been kind of opponents that are teams that they're fighting for the playoffs and that they have done a good job in terms of beating them. But obviously last week when they lose to Vancouver, a team that they should of course get all 3 points and that they didn't get it, that's where I do have a little bit of a doubt. And I do have some doubt in terms of that Minnesota attack where I thought, a couple of weeks ago when the attack was basically hitting in full cylinder, all of a sudden in these last 2 games, and especially in the last game against Vancouver, they have really stuttered and they have looked like their old self, and that I'm worried about the fact that if this attack doesn't get going again, do they have enough in terms of actually making the playoff push, and that do they have enough to able to maintain that spot when they do head to the tough part of the schedule. Now, before I move on to the Eastern Conference, I'm gonna do a couple of teams that would have been on this list, but are kind of like an honorable mention, or I should say an unhonorable mention to the teams that most likely will miss the playoffs in the Western Conference. And those teams are Sporting KC, San Jose Earthquakes, and also RSL as the team that I could have easily put it on the list. And I think Sporting KC is going to be a team that I'm going to have a lot of people in the comments section said that they should be on the board right now because they're below the red line. But I still believe that somehow they will figure out. Like, it feels too surreal that Sporting KC is going to miss the playoffs. And as bad as things have gone, I'm hoping that eventually they're going to turn it around and that eventually they're going to start winning games so that they can, of course, charge up in the Western Conference table. But yeah, we shall see how that is going to be going. But now moving on into the Eastern Conference and the 5 teams that I think is going to miss the playoffs. The first team is not a big surprise, and it's actually the team that I'm actually wearing the jersey on this video, is FC Cincinnati. No explanation needed of why FC Cincinnati is going to miss the playoffs because, yeah, they were pretty much done when they were on that very bad run between May and June, and that, yeah, everybody knows that FC Cincinnati is not going to make the playoffs and that they could actually be a prime candidate of eventually winning the Wooden Spoon. Now, another candidate that could potentially win the Wooden Spoon and most likely will not make the playoffs is the Columbus Crew, which is their Ohio rival. And you know the old saying goes of the fact that Ohio, hell is real. Yeah, hell is definitely real for these two Ohio teams that is sitting in the bottom of the Eastern Conference. And while Columbus have won back-to-back games and started to look much better, I still doubt that they're going to make the playoffs because, one, they're so far back in terms of the playoff race. They're still 9 points back of the playoff line with just 10 games to play, which is just a little bit too much to overcome. And two, they're still a team that is kind of on a rebuilding year, and that we've seen before where when we see bad teams this season, they tend to have a couple of games of good run and then they just go back to their old self. And then FC Cincinnati is another example of that, where a couple of weeks ago they had I think they had a back-to-back win kind of stretch, and then they started to go back to their old self. So that could potentially happen to the Columbus Crew. That is definitely probably not going to make the playoffs because of the fact that they're just too far back in terms of the playoff race and the fact that they're just kind of rebuilding right now. The next team that I think is going to miss the playoffs is going to be the Chicago Fire. And, the Fire has really become a team that has become a team that's been very inconsistent to now just downright awful. And what has been the problem for the Chicago Fire this season has been the lack of finishing. And also the unpredictability of this team. I mean, when you look at most of the Chicago Fire game, it's usually that they put a lot of shots on goal, but they cannot put the final product in. Or the fact that they have one game where they look like they're like Atlanta United, and that they of course beat Atlanta United 5-0 in that game. Or they can just lose very badly in the very next game and just decide not to show up whatsoever. This team is just so inconsistent, and just things have just gone in a tailspin with this team that it kind of, in some way, kind of reminds me of last year with the Chicago Fire, where it was almost the same story, where they were kind of inconsistent. They were kind of on the playoff picture, but then they just took a nosedive after I believe in June, and it seemed like it's the same case against for the Fire, and that most likely they are not going to make the playoffs this season. Now, the fourth team that I think are not going to make the playoffs this season is going to be Orlando City. And just as I said about the Western Conference, where these next two teams, I am going to get disagreement, and that I'm kind of not really confident whether or not if I'm going to get these right at the end of the season. Orlando City is one of those teams, because I do see the fact that this team could make the playoffs if they could have just win their home games, which is one of the reasons why they are not in the playoff hunt, because they have lost so many home games and dropped so many points at home that you cannot afford to drop that many points at home and expect to be winning or expect to be making the playoffs this season. And even if Orlando City has a pretty respectable road record, you just cannot do that with that many drop points at home. And the second thing is, like the Chicago Fire, they have had a couple of games where they have issue in terms of putting the ball into the back of the net, and that they're also are kind of an inconsistent team where, in one game they can put the ball into the back of the net and be very clinical, despite the fact that they only have like 8 shots or stuff like that. But then there's going to be a game where they have like 19 shots and 7 shots on goal, and they just can't put the ball into the back of the net. So, it's very frustrating with this Orlando City team, in that it's just a very kind of inconsistent kind of team. And if they do not figure out this inconsistent form and also not start winning games at home, I really doubt that this team is going to make the playoffs for the first time this season. And I really want this team to make the playoffs. I mean, Orlando City, throughout their time in MLS, they still have not made the playoffs, and that I think they're the only team in the league since their expansion year has not made the playoffs this season. And I think with the fan base that Orlando City has, this is a team that definitely deserved to make the playoffs. But with the on-field performance and the way that they performed this season, there's definitely a lot of doubt whether or not if they can make the playoffs or not. Now, the last team that I think could potentially not make the playoffs, and this is definitely going to get a lot of disagreement, and this one is a bold kind of prediction, but I'm going to say DC is going to miss the playoffs. And I know what you're thinking. Why in the world did I put a team that is currently third in the Eastern Conference and say that they aren't going to miss the playoffs? Well, the reason why I put that is because DC have been looking very kind of mediocre for the past couple of weeks, or even the past couple of months. I mean, this DC team, they have just had problems in terms of scoring, and the fact that they have just kind of grind out some resort, and that there's times where I think with them just keep grinding out resort and keep winning 1-0 game like this, it's eventually going to come back to haunt them, and that they're going to have games where their attack is just not going to click whatsoever. And the last game was a good example of that, when they were playing against the Chicago Fire, where, they look really bad in that game and didn't look like a playoff team whatsoever. And the fact that they're only 4 points out of the playoffs, and that they actually have played the most game out of any Eastern Conference team has played so far, that makes me very concerned about this team in terms of the playoff chances. I mean, guys on that attack like Lucho Acosta, Wayne Rooney, and Paul Arriola has really regressed this year, and that, I just think that, if DC continue to go on this mediocre run, and especially there are teams now in below the red line that are hungry to try to get that spot, and that eventually the dam is going to broke for DC. Like, the dam hasn't broke yet for DC in terms of them being at the top of the standing for so long, but there's just been so many warning signs, and there's been so many cracks that you can see that the dam is about to broke with this team, and that this team cannot just keep having games where they look like a very mediocre team, and a team that definitely shouldn't be belonging in the top part of the table. Eventually that's going to happen, and that they will really go on to a free fall in terms of going below the red line. Now, there are a couple of teams that I would also do an honorable mention in terms of potentially miss the playoffs. And there's actually a lot of teams that I could say that could be on this list. I could say TFC could be one of the team that probably could have been on the list. Montreal is another team that could have been on the list. New England, as much as how hot New England has been, I don't know if this kind of form will just continue. Like, at some point, this kind of unbeaten run does come to an end, and when it comes to an end, we shall see if they can, of course, bounce back and continue another good run to propel them to make the playoffs. And I even will just straight on and put even another bold prediction in the unhonorable mention and put Philly in that list. Because Philly, as much as they're in the top of the Eastern Conference, they have looked very mediocre in the last couple of games. And if they continue that mediocre form, yeah, who would have thought that a team that is in the top of the Eastern Conference for a majority part of the season could actually miss the playoffs? Like, the East is so tight right now that the spots are really up for grabs, and that you could really see some teams that is near the top of the table could easily go down below the red line if they do have a bad run of form. But either way, guys, I hope you guys enjoyed this video. If you do, make sure you guys leave a like, smash that subscribe button. Let me know in the comments below what do you think of this list. And like I said, if I put your team on this list, let me know in the comments below that if you disagree with it, why do you think that these teams should not be on the list of the teams that will miss the playoffs. But yeah, hope you guys enjoyed this video, and I will see you guys next time.